Hello, students. Yesterday we were looking at Coleridge's theory of imagination and fancy, and today we'll be looking at the other aspect of his theory that deals with what is poetry, who is a poet, and who is a poet genius. So, coming back to the text, if you look at page number 154, the last paragraph is telling that what is poetry is so nearly the same question with what is a poet, that the answer to the one is involved in the solution of the other. That means if we want to talk about the poet, we can also find the answer of poetry. So he is telling they are interrelated and he is going to answer them not very distinctively but simultaneously. But it is a distinction resulting from the poetic genius itself, which sustains and modifies the images, thoughts, and emotions of the poet's own mind. And he is telling that both the concept of poetry and poet can be found within the poetic genius, which itself sustains and modifies the images, thoughts, and emotions within the poet's mind. The poet described in ideal perfection brings the whole soul of man into activity. So he is telling the poet is actually an ideal perfection. The poet is not an ordinary man, because yesterday we discussed during the categorization of first imagination and secondary imagination, primary and secondary, that the primary imagination is universal, it is there with every man, but the secondary belongs only to the poet. So the poet is distinct from ordinary man, and therefore he is telling the poet is an ideal perfection who brings the whole soul of man into activity with the subordination of its faculties to each other according to their relative worth and dignity. And the poet uses all the faculties of a man according to their need or priority. But in all this selection of the human faculties, which are being subordinated by the ideal, all the time there is an emphasis on dignity. That means the poet is a dignified soul. The poet subordinates the ordinary human faculties to represent its ideal. Then he is telling he diffuses a tone and spirit of unity that blends and, as it were, fuses each into each by that synthetic and magical power to which I would exclusively appropriate the name of imagination. So, what the poet does? The poet is an ideal perfection who subordinates its faculties and retains the dignity. Then, what is the function of the poet? The function diffuses a tone and a spirit of unity. The tone and spirit of unity, the ideal, is being diffused. It blends, it unifies, fuses each into each. It unifies every human faculty with another human faculty. For example, the perception is a faculty, the thought is a faculty, the action is a faculty, and so on and so forth. Therefore, the poetic genius or the poet, he first diffuses, like the primary imagination, each of the faculties. Then he blends them by that synthetic magical power which is called imagination. And through imagination, he again blends them into a new whole. That means the poet develops the ordinary human faculties into something extraordinary by first diffusing it, then blending them with each other in an ideal and dignified manner. This power, first put in action by the will and understanding, and retained under their irremissive, though gentle and unnoticed control. And how this power of imagination functions in a poet? It puts by action the will and understanding. The poet must be willing and understanding. Everyone cannot be a poet unless someone wills and understands the two important parts of being a good poet. There must be the will to be a poet, and there must be the comprehension or understanding. And it is retained under their irremissive, though gentle and unnoticed control. And there must be a third dimension of the poet, that is the strong urge or power, which is irremissible. It cannot be remissioned. And it works not in a very dashing, pushing manner, rather in a gentle and unnoticed control. Though there is a great urge within the poet or the poet's mind, but it is not visible from outside. The poet never rushes outside, never runs, never exhibits what is under or within his mind. The storm within his mind is not visible to the outside world. He works in a very gentle and unnoticed manner with great restraint, with great control. And reveals itself in the balance or reconcilement of opposite or discordant qualities of sameness with difference, of the general with the concrete. And he reveals himself through balance or reconcilement of opposite. The binaries are being made into some concealment. And in spite of the difference, he finds out some similarity. That means the previously discussed thing from Wordsworth, similarity in dissimilarity. The general with the concrete. And he also blends the concrete images with the general ideas. The idea with the image. He also blends idea with the image. That means a bird is the image, but with the image of the bird, he brings the idea of freedom or the idea of desire to soar above. The individual with the representative. The sense of novelty and freshness with old and familiar objects. So, novelty with familiarity. More than usual state of emotion with more than usual order. He also blends emotion with discipline, order. Judgment ever awake and steady self-possession with enthusiasm. So, self-possession and judgment with enthusiasm and feeling profound or vehement. And while it blends and harmonizes the natural and the artificial, still subordinates art to nature. And in this process of blending and harmonizing the natural and artificial or any such binaries, he subordinates art to nature. He is not consciously creating, or he is not creating the art, rather he wants to remain with nature. Means the nature within man and outside man. The manner to the matter, and our admiration of the poet to our sympathy with the poetry. So, in this way, a poet blends all these binaries and he is a poet. That is the process of imagination. So, the imagination is a highly synthetic concept according to Coleridge. It is an assemblastic power. He calls it assemblastic power. It has the plastic power, means blending all these binaries. So you mind, particularly this part of the paragraph, the short question can be asked that how the poet is an assemblastic personage, or how poetry is an assemblastic power. That poetry blends or brings down both extremes or binaries in this manner through imagination. Okay. Now, in the next paragraph, he is still talking about finally, good sense is the body of poetic genius. Fancy it drapery, motions its life, and imagination the soul. That is everywhere, and in each, and forms all into one graceful and intelligent whole. So he is telling that good sense is the body of poetic genius. So, what is poetic genius? The poetic genius means already we have come to know the poet is an ideal perfection. The poet who is a great blender of the binary, who subordinates the faculties and brings out the dignity. But finally, there should be good sense. Without good sense, somebody cannot be a poet. Somebody cannot be a poetic genius. And what is good sense? Good sense means, again, coming back to nature, that which is natural, benevolent, because nature is basically benevolent. If somebody is having a great grudge, a great hatred, he or she cannot be a good poet. In spite of all the faculties, in spite of all the power of imagination, everything. A good sense, therefore, is the body of poetic genius. And fancy is its drapery. And he needs fancy, but it is only for decoration, it is only for the attiring. Motion needs life, and motion is the life of poetic genius. Motion means movement. The poet must move, and it is not only the physical movement, but it is also the mental movement. Mentally, the poet must be in a fluid state, must be moving. The mind should not be stagnant. As well as physically, the poet should also move. If he cannot move and discover the nature in its different forms, different manifestations, how can he blend, how can he merge so many ideas into the images? And imagination, the soul, that is everywhere. And imagination is the soul of great poet, the poetic genius. And all these are formed into one graceful and intelligent whole. When they will be bound together in a graceful and intelligent whole, that is poetic genius. So, this is the short question for what is a poetic genius for 2 marks. Then, in the next page, he is discussing about Pindar, Chaucer, Dante, Milton, and many more, and instances of the close connections of poetic genius with the love of liberty and genuine reformation. So, he is trying to explain the good sense by telling that the poetic genius of all these great poets are always related with love of liberty and genuine reformation. There is a philosophic no less than a poetic genius, which is different from the highest perfection of talent, not by degree, but by kind. Not much difference, and the difference, if there is any, there is by kind, not in degree. A philosophic genius and a poetic genius, they are the highest perfection of talent. Then, in the last paragraph of this paper, of this page, he is giving out the qualities of great poets or the great poetic genius. Number one, he is telling, in the Venus and Adonis, the first and most obvious excellence is the perfect sweetness of the versification, its adaptation to the subject, and the power displayed in varying the march of the words without passing into a loftier and more majestic rhythm than was demanded by the thoughts. So, what is the first excellence of a poetic genius? It is the perfect sweetness of the versification. The poetic genius must be perfectly able to make sweet versification. Unless you make your versification very sweet, sweet in the sense not all the time melodious, but must be very rhythmic. So, a great poet must be highly rhythmic, and adaptation to the subject and the power displayed in varying much. And the adaptation of his versification must be suitable to the subject. According to the subject, there should be versification. Suppose the verse is about war, or the verse is about love, or the verse is about lamentation. So, accordingly, the versification should be there. The heroic versification cannot be related to a love poem. So, the great poet, the poetic genius, must be a great judge of how to use appropriate versification with a particular subject. Then, next page 157, the second point he is telling, a second promise of genius is the choice of subjects very remote from the private interests and circumstances of the writer himself. So, the second excellence or promise of a great genius, poetic genius, is the choice of subject. The poet must choose a subject. The poet should not be all the time absorbing any subject thrown at him. There is coronavirus, you compose a poem. There is market problem, compose a poem. Unemployment, compose a poem. Sorry. That is not the quality of a great poet. The great poet chooses his own subject, and which is very remote from private interest, and which should be not of his own interest, which should be the interest of his great power of thought, his great power of appreciating the nature, both within him and outside him. In the next paragraph, he is elaborating it further by telling, it has been before observed that images, however beautiful, though faithfully copied from nature and as accurately represented in words, do not of themselves characterize the poet. Though the poet must be responding to the nature, as I told you, within and outside him, but he is telling that suppose the images faithfully copied from nature and accurately represented in words do not characterize the poet, because if they are divorced from the poetic instinct. That means if there is no poetic instinct, but you are very accurately taking any image, suppose you are sitting and suddenly you felt, let me compose a poem because I have not composed a poem for last week, and bring out some beautiful images from nature and started composing a poem, then you are not a poetic genius. A poetic genius is always guided by his own poetic instinct. They become proofs of original genius only as far as they are modified by a predominant passion. Therefore, he is telling the poet or the poetic genius be modified by a predominant passion. There should be passion within. Without that passion, you can't be a poetic genius. You can't be a professional poetic genius. If you are composing your poems in a professional manner or commercial manner or whimsical manner, you can't be a poetic genius. The poetic genius is a person who is guided by his passion. The next page 158, the third characteristic. The last character I shall mention, which would prove indeed but little, except as taken conjointly with the former, yet without which the former could scarce exist in a high degree. So, this is the third characteristic of a poetic genius. And he is telling, no man was ever yet a great poet if without being at the same time a profound philosopher. So, you can't be a great poet without being a profound philosopher. So, a poet must be a great philosopher. For poetry is the blossom and the fragrancy of all human knowledge, human thoughts, human passions, emotions, language. And why a poet must be a great philosopher? Because poetry is the abode of all human knowledge. Here you will find all human knowledges are there. Human thoughts, human passions, emotion, language. Therefore, Coleridge is praising Shakespeare. In Shakespeare's poems, the creative power and the intellectual energy wrestle as in a war embrace. So, Shakespeare, being a poetic genius, in his work, he finds both the intellectual energy and the creative power. They are competing with each other in a very mutual and blending manner. So, an ideal poet, a great poet, must have the binary of creative power and intellectual energy. Then, in the next paragraph, he is coming to the don'ts. Now, already he has told about what are the do's or what are the positive characteristics of a poetic genius. Now, he is telling, so genius cannot be lawless, for it is even this that constitutes its genius, the power of acting creatively under the laws of its own origination. You can note it as the fourth characteristic, that the genius cannot be lawless. That you are a genius, as commonly we think, why this boy is behaving like that? Oh, sir, he thinks he is a genius. That means he thinks he is a genius, so he is out of bound of any law, of any discipline. But Coleridge is telling the poetic genius cannot be lawless. Why? Because the power of acting creatively under laws of its own organization. When you are a poet, you must act under the power or the laws of your own organization. You are an organization by yourself as a genius. So you must be abiding by your own law, by your own capability. If you don't do that, then what will happen? Your poetry cannot give consistent meaning cannot give or create a meaning by itself. In the next page, again he is telling the true ground of the mistake lies in the confounding mechanical regularity with organic form. The form is mechanic. He is discussing about Voltaire and Shakespeare, and he is telling if there is any mistake we find in some great poets, the mistake is there in the mechanical regularity with organic form. That means the form of poetry is organic. But sometimes, if the poet goes on doing it in a following it in a regular mechanical manner, that means suppose, as I told you, suppose you want to compose 100 sonnets, and in all these 100 sonnets you are bringing in different emotions, different subjects, then what will happen? The problem will come. The sonnet form is suitable for certain particular emotions, particular passions. But if you put other passions or emotions into that form, then that will create a problem. So the poet should not do that. The poet should not be lawless, and the poet should not continuously following the form mechanical by making it mechanical. Then he is telling the organic form, on the other hand, is innate. It shapes as it develops itself from within, and the fullness of its development is one and the same with the perfection of its outward form. Then what the poet should do? The great poet or the poetic genius should go for the organic form instead of the mechanical form. So what is organic form? He is elaborating. It may come for 1 mark or 2 mark question. The organic form, on the other hand, is innate. It is an innate form. It is not having any definite form. It shapes as it develops. Its shape will emerge as you will go with your passion and emotion from within, and fullness of its development is one and the same. And when it is developed, it becomes a unitary form, a unitary body, and it is perfect by itself. It is unique. Such as the life is, such is the form. So he is suggesting the poet should follow the organic form by following the ways of life. As the life is different and unique in every moment, so should be the poetic form. The poetry should be related in that manner. Then in page 160, the last line is telling, it is essential to poetry that it be simple and appeal to the elements and primary laws of our nature, that it be sensuous and by its imagery elicit truth at a flash. Now he is coming back to poetry and is telling that poetry should be simple and it should appeal to the elements and primary laws of our nature. What are the primary laws of our nature? Our basic emotions, our passions. So if the poetry is not appealing to that, it cannot be a good poetry. And it should be simple. Simple in the sense, not composing by only simple language, but should be simple in rendering the emotion or the passion. And it should be sensuous by its imagery and elicit the truth at a flash. Within a flash, there should be truth that the reader is able to know what exactly the poet is going to bring out. Then the next page he is telling, if everything that pleases be poetry, Pope's satires and epistles must be poetry. This I must say that poetry, as distinguished from other modes of composition, doesn't rest in meter, and that it is not poetry if it makes no appeal to our passions or our imagination. So he's telling, some critics are telling poetry must please, but he's telling only pleasure is not the component of poetry. He's giving the example of Pope Alexander Pope, and he's telling Pope's poetry pleases by its satire, but I don't consider it great poetry. Why? Because it doesn't appeal to our passion or our imagination. So a good poetry must appeal to our passions and our imaginations. Now, Coleridge is coming back to the imitation, and he's talking about the imitation of nature as told by Plato and Aristotle. So he is telling in page 162, we must imitate nature, yes, but what in nature? All and everything? No. Beautiful in nature. And what then is the beautiful? What is beauty? So he is telling at the last part of this paragraph, the sense of beauty is intuitive, and beauty itself is all that inspires pleasures without and aloof from, and even contrarily to interest. Aristotle told that poet must imitate the ideal in nature, and Coleridge is telling the beautiful in nature. And how he is explaining the beauty? That the sense of beauty is intuitive. The beauty is not a concept of universal thing, it is intuitive, and itself is all that inspires pleasure, that thing which inspires pleasure without. That means it comes from within. The poet is inspired, or we are inspired by something what we call beauty. And aloof from, which may be aloof from others or the universal concept, and even contrary to interest. Here, if you don't mind, I will give you an example that sometimes we even criticize our friends or whatever, whoever may be, that somebody has fallen in love with someone, and suddenly somebody is asking how you have fallen with that girl or that boy. She's not good looking, or he's not handsome. So here what happens? You must have found some beauty somewhere which is not visible to others. So same is the thing. The beauty is intuitive, and the poet must be inspired by the pleasure from that beauty. In the next page, first paragraph, he is telling, if the artist copies the mere nature, the natura naturata, what idle rivalry? If he proceeds only from a given form which is supposed to answer to the notion of beauty. That means he is telling the artist should not copy the mere nature. Why? Because he must be attracted by the notion of beauty in nature. And that natura naturata should be natura naturana, which presupposes a bond between nature in the higher sense and the soul of man. So he is telling natura naturata should not be imitated, but natura naturana, which is a bond between nature in the higher sense and the soul of man, must be imitated by the poet. Then the next paragraph is elaborating. The wisdom is in nature is distinguished from that in man by the co-instantaneity of the plan and the execution. The thought and the product are one, or are given at once, but there is no reflex act, and hence there is no moral responsibility. In man, there is reflection. Freedom and choice is therefore the head of the visible creation. So, being a romantic poet, Coleridge puts man in the center of the creation. Therefore, he is telling man is having reflection, freedom, choice, and for that he is head of the visible creation. Therefore, he must have the wisdom which is there within the nature. The wisdom of man and the wisdom in nature, they are being differentiated. But man must imitate that wisdom in nature. As Wordsworth has already said, nature within and outside. So when the poet will be able to blend that wisdom of nature with wisdom of man, he can bring the best of the poetry. In page 164, the first line is compressing that idea to make nature thought and thought nature. This is the mystery of genius in the fine arts. So, a great poetic genius, he must make the external internal, the internal external, and nature thought and thought nature. And that is the mystery of a poetic genius or a great poet. And then he is going to elaborate all these things. I am not going through it. You can read it thoroughly. And in the last paragraph of page 164, he is again telling Shakespeare has evinced the power which above all other men he possessed, that of introducing the profoundest sentiment of wisdom. So he is praising Shakespeare, like Johnson, that he was having that power, that blending of wisdom of man with wisdom of nature. And in this way, what he is doing? He is giving us the great idea about a poetic genius, a great poet, good poetry, and the theory of imitation once again. And finally, in the last page, you will find that he is telling by the spontaneous activity of his imagination and fancy, and by whatever else with these reveals itself in the balancing and reconciling of opposite or discordant qualities, sameness with difference, a sense of novelty and freshness with old or customary objects, a more than usual state of emotion with more than usual order, self possession, and judgment, and so on and so forth. Our admiration of the poet to our sympathy with the images, passions, characters, and incidents of the poem. Is again summing up all his ideas in this long paragraph to say that his idea of a poet is a great soul who can comprehend the universal soul, the soul of the nature within himself, and is able to blend them together even with their contradictions and binary. So I think you are now able to get the idea of Coleridge and his critical theory. Thank you.